Welcome to Southold Historical Society's virtual exhibit on Stella Prince, Horton Point's Lady Lighthouse Keeper. I am Mary Corpy, a docent at Horton Point, and I am happy to share with you some interesting information I've uncovered in preparation for a book I'm writing about Stella Maria Prince Terry. The Prince family. The Princes are direct descendants of Captain John Prince, a whaler from Bedford, Massachusetts, who settled in Southold in the 1700s. George Staley Prince, Stella's father, grew up in Southold, the oldest of 4 children. In 1861, he enlisted and was wounded twice during the Civil War. After he was discharged, he returned to Southold, and in 1866, he married Caroline Merrill Prince. They had 2 daughters, Stella in 1867, and 17 months later, Lucy. Before he worked as a lighthouse keeper, George was a carpenter, and he built their family home on Prince Lane, now known as Mechanic Street, just behind the parsonage of the Methodist Church, where Caroline was an active member. This is a picture of Horton Point Lighthouse in the early 1900s. A little background. In 1790, President George Washington commissioned Horton Point Lighthouse. It was built 67 years later, in 1857. It is located on a 66-foot-high bluff overlooking the Long Island Sound, along a section of the sound that was referred to as Dead Man's Cove due to frequent shipwrecks. The Lighthouse Service, a federal agency, oversaw all U.S. lighthouses until the early 1900s. In 1870, the cottage at Horton Point was renovated. A second story was added, and the main floor was divided into 2 separate living spaces. This allowed 2 families to more comfortably cohabitate at Horton Point. In this picture there are 2 stories and a front porch, and the cottage is attached to the tower. These additions were all added around 1870. Although Horton Point is only 2 miles from the center of the hamlet of Southold, before 1879 there was no road that led to it. Visitors had to pass through fenced fields, which required stopping at each of 3 gates before continuing along a rutted pathway. One can only imagine the apprehension of the Prince family might have experienced, packing up their belongings and leaving the close-knit town of Southold to venture off to live at the lighthouse in 1870. Today, the lighthouse is entirely automated and operates under the jurisdiction of the Coast Guard. It is still a navigational aid with its unique beacon flashing a green light every 10 seconds. The Keepers. From 1857 to 1933, 9 different lighthouse keepers lived and worked at Horton Point, many with their families. Stella was the only woman to serve at Horton Point. Officially, there were at least 3 other female lighthouse keepers on Long Island previous to Stella. They served at Oldfield Point Lighthouse in Setauket. Now this lists the keepers who worked during the years that Stella lived at Horton Point. George Prince, her father, was a carpenter, and then he was commissioned by the Lighthouse Service to become the assistant keeper in 1869 under Captain Goldsmith. Now, when Captain Goldsmith retired in 1877, George became the head keeper, and the captain's son, Daniel Goldsmith, became the assistant keeper. Now, Daniel served until 1881. When he was terminated, Stella became the unofficial keeper at 13 years old in 1881. She continued to serve as the unofficial keeper until 1903, even when her father was discharged in 1896 and Captain Robert Ebbets came on as the head keeper. Stella continued to live at the lighthouse and work unofficially. In 1903, due to an accident that Captain Ebbets had, we'll talk more about that later, Stella became the official acting keeper at Horton Point by order of President Roosevelt. Now, the picture on the right shows the Fresnel lens. This is the lens that currently sits inside Horton Point's Maritime Museum. This was the type of lens used during the Stella's years at the lighthouse. The Fresnel lens was invented by a French physicist, Augustus Fresnel, in 1820, and is designed to amplify the light from the oil-burning lamps. Fresnel lenses come in 7 orders or sizes. Horton Point had a 3rd order lens, which could be seen for 14 miles north to Connecticut and south to Shinnecock on a clear night. George Prince's Journal, 1888. Amy Folk at Southold Historical uncovered this journal. Journaling was a common practice at that time. In George's journal, he mentions his wife, whom he refers to as Mrs. P, 3 times in the year, and he writes every day, and his daughter Stella only once. His other daughter Lucy and the birth of his first granddaughter in that July are not mentioned at all. I've selected just a few of George's writings to give you a sense of his world. Sunday, January 1st. Severe storm, horrid rain, 3 a.m. till 11 p.m. Monday, February 2nd. Eyes and throat inflamed, worse at night. Sent Mrs. P to doc. Wednesday, April 11th. Sold 10 dozen eggs. The steamer Cactus left 2 lamps. More about the Cactus later. Wednesday, June 27th. Had beets and cabbage of my own raising. Tuesday, August 28th. Received annual supplies. Monday, September 17th. Caught 14 bluefish, sold 11 for $1. Got pension check, $6. Thursday, November 22nd. Went to woods and got bag of leaves for bedding. Wednesday, December 12th. Haircut, had hogs killed. Tuesday, December 25. Visited family. Thursday, December 27. Mrs. P and I went to see Aunt Jane. Keepers in skirts. Officially, over 300 women served as keepers during the over 100 years of manned lighthouses in the U.S. The designation officially is very important because this meant that they were being paid for their work. Just like farm life, all family members were expected to pitch in at the lighthouse. Everyone learned how to tend the light from an early age. Most women lighthouse keepers started as the wife or daughter of a male keeper. An interesting fact, during the 1850s and 1860s, there were more women keepers on the West Coast due to the gold rush. And then the Civil War also resulted in a shortage of males, which led to increased opportunities for female keepers. But generally the route was they were the wife or the daughter, their husband or father became ill or passed away, and they sometimes got the position, sometimes not. Although male keepers had an official uniform, the lighthouse service never issued one for women. The modest dress of the day would be quite cumbersome, as you can see from the picture on the right. Some women keepers wore their husband's trousers. We don't have any record of Stella's choice in that regard, so we can assume she wore the traditional clothing of the day. And as you can see, this would be very difficult navigating your way up that circular stairway, 2 ladders to get to the lantern, carrying the oil, which would weigh about 40 pounds. A child's life. We're fortunate to have record from the daughter of our last keeper at Horton Point, Margaret Earhart Conway, wrote in her story Lighthouse Memories, and here's a quote, "As a child, we enjoyed picking wild grapes, beach plums, berries, and asparagus. Friday was lamp cleaning day, which meant that everyone helped. We walked the long distance to Southold School. It's about 2 miles, and there's a road now at least. We felt safe at the lighthouse because there was a lightning rod sunk in sand near the building. There were few modern comforts, an outside privy, a pump for water, and kerosene lamps. Now the water pump was located in the neighbor's field, which was quite a long walk to get to. Remember, they're up on a 66-foot high bluff, so they'd have to dig a very deep well to get to fresh water, and actually might strike salt water first, so that their well was built back on the neighbor's field. But like most lighthouses, a cistern collected rainwater from the gutters on the roof and ran into the basement. Now the job of keeping the cistern clean was quite important, and it was painted once a year with lead-based paint. One can only hope that this water was used for cleaning only. Now on the second point on the slide, I have information from a young man who grew up at a lighthouse in Maine, Fillmore Wass. And in his book, Lighthouses in My Life, he writes, 4 times a year, the inspector from the lighthouse service arrived, unannounced, to check on every aspect: the lens, the keeper's logs, and even our quarters. Inspection time surpassed all others in sheer excitement. Although Father maintained a good station, everything had to be ship-shape for inspection. U.S.S. Cactus. This is an early supply ship. This is actually the one that brought the supplies to Horton Point during many of the years that Stella lived there. Along with the supplies, the government inspector would arrive. They would come 4 times a year on no particular schedule, so keepers didn't have any idea when the ship would arrive. Even though Horton Point was a landlocked lighthouse, all supplies were brought by ship. Now this shows the tender that would be taken off the ship and then loaded with all the things that they needed to bring to Horton Point. They would then have to row between the rocks that jut out along the coast, and then the supplies would have to be carried up the 66-foot bluff. At that time, there was a stairway directly in front of the lighthouse. Now the stairway to access the beach is to the east of the lighthouse at the end of the road. School and church. These are 2 very important aspects of Stella and Lucy's lives. We know that Stella and Lucy attended school in Southold, as the local paper lists them as honor roll recipients, as well as the fact that Stella gave a declamation speech at graduation in 1880. A declamation speech is a presentation that might consist of reading a poem or a notable passage from literature. 1 year later, in 1881, Daniel Goldsmith was terminated, sealing 13-year-old Stella's fate as the unofficial keeper. With the termination of Daniel Goldsmith, George did receive a $50 increase of pay, so his salary was now $600 a year, as he was to now assume full responsibility for the light with the help of his family. But when Lucy married several years later, his salary was cut back to the $550 he had previously received. We don't know the reason behind this, but one less mouth to feed. Attendance at the Methodist Church in Southold was the center of both religious and social life for the Prince women. In both Stella and Caroline's obituaries, it is noted that they were faithful members and strong supporters of all church activities. Now this picture shows the view of the back of Horton Point facing north, looking north. It shows that there was a garden in the back. Now, lighthouse keepers did generally grow gardens, if at all possible, to supplement the government supplies that they received. They would receive the dry goods, but to get fresh food, they would grow their own, they would store it. They would also have farm animals when possible, certainly chickens, maybe even a cow or a goat. But whatever they could do to supplement what they were getting from the government would be critically important for the health of them and their families. Winter pursuits. Reading was ubiquitous to the entire light-keeping corps, children included. In 1876, the government began supplying portable libraries. Each library came in its own oak case with doors and a key, so it could be set upright as a piece of furniture. 4 times a year, the libraries were exchanged by the visiting supply tender. Each library was numbered and contained about 50 different titles. When there was time to spare and the wind was howling outside the door, it was comforting to curl up with a good book. And this is a quote from Guardians of the Light, one of the books that I found for research here. But I just have to wonder how difficult it would have been to lift this, what had to be a very heavy crate of 50 books, and get it up into various lighthouses. Horton Point being difficult in of itself, but many of the other lighthouses would have been far more difficult to get this crate up and into the lighthouse safely. Life at Horton Point was not without special times. The birth of a baby at the lighthouse. Daniel Goldsmith's wife Martha gave birth to Martha Elizabeth Goldsmith on April 10, 1879. 12-year-old Stella and 10-year-old Lucy might have been very pleased to have this new baby to fuss over. The birth of the baby at the Lighthouse also heightened the pressure to build a road leading to Horton Point. Back in August of 1878, there was an article in the paper that said Horton Point Lighthouse is one of the attractions for visitors, and there should be a pleasant road leading to it. Now, visitors did enjoy seeing the lighthouse, and it is part of the keeper's job to show them the workings and bring them up into the tower, as long as it wasn't lit. Now, back to the road. In February of 1879, there are now three fence lines to be crossed, and when Captain Salata puts up 2 or 3 more cross fences, those who drive through will find it a lively passage. This is a quote from a story in the Long Island Traveler. Now, just 7 days after the birth of baby Martha, on April 17, 1879, the Commissioners of Highways, by unanimous verdict, approved the road. And then by the fall of 1879, the road to Horton Point was completed. Now, a golden wedding celebration. The Long Island Traveler writes that on Saturday, March 8, 1884, the 50th anniversary of Captain and Mrs. Daniel Goldsmith of Southold was celebrated. The host and hostess bore the shock of surprise with the fortitude of younger days. A feast was spread, bearing loving gifts, flowers, and even roses, and in the middle a richly decorated golden wedding cake surrounded by 50 gold tapers. Now the Goldsmiths were the head keepers who the princess worked with for many years, and one can only assume that they were invited to this wonderful party, and the excitement for now young teens Stella and Lucy would be quite wonderful, considering the life that their day-to-day life. And the paper goes on to say, the crowning joy was the arrival of the long-absent daughter, who came from her distant home with a winsome little maiden, a stranger grandchild. And finally, reminiscences shared with wit and wisdom, music, singing, and earnest wishes for continued health and happiness. All in all, a spectacular party, and I would expect quite unusual in 1884 for a couple to celebrate their 50th wedding anniversary. The watchroom. So now we go back to the day-to-day life at the lighthouse. The watchroom, which is located at the top of the 28-step circular stairway and the first of the 2 11-step ladders just below the lantern room. Now, keepers spent many long hours sitting in the watchroom so they would have quick access if the beacon went out during the night. There typically was a small chair there, so the keeper would not get too comfortable, as they needed to stay awake throughout the night. Now, the door that you see, the picture on the left, is the door that leads to the lantern deck. Now, this door has a stairway that then, with a deck that goes around the exterior of the light, and this would be used to clean the outside of the windows of the lantern room. Lucy Merrill, Prince Scott. One can only assume that these 2 little girls, born only 17 months apart and isolated from other children, must have been close. However, Lucy follows a more traditional path than her sister, marrying at 18. She has 4 children by the time she's 28 and dies at 44. In 1893, Lucy purchased from Seth Tuthill the old Prince Homestead house and moved it to Prince Lane. In 1894, it burned to the ground. All survived, but Ed Scott moved his family and his business to Sag Harbor. Now, in 1902, we know that Lucy, now widowed, returns to Prince Lane with her 4 children and has her house built on the same property where the other house had burnt down. We don't really know much about what happened to Ed Scott. We know that he passed away, but there's no date and there's no obituary that I could find for him. We know that he was a jeweler and that he was pretty successful, and he did, after the fire, they did live on the South Fork. Here we go. George's escapade. Of the 9 keepers who served at Horton Point, George Prince lasted the longest. However, in early 1896, a warrant was issued for his arrest for having taken part in the serenade given to two newlyweds. The newlyweds were not home, so the men tied a cow in the couple's kitchen, placed pigs in the dining room, and filled the parlor with fowls. Later that year, Keeper Prince was dismissed for drunkenness and neglect of duty. We'll talk more about that later. Caroline's letters to her daughter. Now, these letters were sent to Caroline during George's legal trouble. It appears that Caroline and George moved back to their home on Prince Lane and left Stella to tend the lighthouse. One can assume this was a very difficult time for the family as they waited for George to be charged and for the lighthouse service to decide his fate. It is not likely that they would allow George to continue working, as drunkenness is a fireable offense, as well as the fact that this escapade took place in the evening, so George was not at the lighthouse. Stella, in all likelihood, was there and tended the lantern, but since she was not the official keeper, it was George's responsibility to be there when the light was lit. In this first letter, Caroline urges Stella to go visit her cousins on Block Island during the 4th, and that she will ensure that George covers the lighthouse while Stella is away. We can see from the writing that Stella and her mom are very close, and she writes, "Darling Stella," and this letter is sent June 13 to Horton's Point. At that time, Horton Point was called Horton's with an S, Point. It was postmarked Southold, June 13, 1896. Now, extrapolating from the letters, it is clear that Caroline loves her daughter, worries about her health and happiness, and is distraught at her husband's continuing irresponsibility. She urges Stella to go away for the 4th. And here's a few quotes that I could get out of the letters. "He was worse than the storm. Stuck here all day, cursed everything black and blue." Well, he certainly doesn't sound like a pleasant person to live with, but particularly during this, had to be a very stressful time. "He wasn't doing you any good or himself either." Now, this gives us some insight into Stella's relationship with her father. Stella was very conscientious about her work at the lighthouse, but George took a more lackluster approach, as is indicated by the inspection reports he received during the years that he worked there. And then the final quote, "They may hire you, has nothing to do with what little he comes through." Now, this is the only concrete indication we have that Stella is hoping to be hired by the lighthouse service to replace her father. Now, in the second letter that Caroline sends to her daughter, it starts off her greeting, "Good morning, dearie," and this is a couple of weeks, the following week. "Must tell you my mishap today. I made a blackberry pie, took it out of the oven, hit the stove hearth, and went bottom up on the floor. Saved part of the crust. The inside was all over the oilcloth. Strawberries to pick now. The flower beds look quite brilliant with roses, pinks, geraniums, and primroses. Be good to yourself. Yours lovingly, Ma." Now, clearly, Stella and her mom are close. In her mom, she's describing her garden in Prince Lane in Southold. Horton's Point, July 6th. Now, it shows that Stella did go away for the 4th and that Caroline filled in at the lighthouse. "Well, dearie, how are you and how is everybody after the 4th? Living, I hope, as am I." She also says, "At Horton Point, I was watching the fireworks all over. Quite a display at Shelter Island. All round east was ablaze." Now, clearly, even back in the 1890s, they knew how to celebrate the 4th on the North Fork. All right, next slide. Now, Stella stays on. A pivotal point in Stella's life. George is discharged for drunkenness and dereliction of duty and returns full-time to Prince Lane with Caroline, but Stella stays at Horton Point. Now, it's quite unusual for an unmarried woman of her day to not live with her parents. As I said previously, Stella lived at Horton Point for 34 of her 60 years. When George left, she stayed on, still unofficially, and worked with his replacement, Captain Ebbets. Why? We don't really know. We don't have a clear idea. Carolyn's letters to Stella support the hypothesis that she was dedicated to her work as a Wickie. Now, Captain Ebbets had served at 2 previous Long Island lighthouses, so he was experienced, but it was just him and his wife. Their sons were grown and did not live with them. It appears that Stella saw this as an opportunity to remain at Horton Point and assist the new keeper. Now, Captain Ebbets' fall. The next pivotal point in Stella's life. On September 1896, Captain Ebbets is appointed as head keeper at Horton Point. It had fallen into quite a bit of disrepair under George's neglect, and Captain Ebbets was very meticulous about bringing everything up to a higher standard. However, on May 9, 1903, a few years after he was there, Ebbets completed painting the circular stairway and attempted to climb a ladder to access the light in the tower. A rung broke, and he plunged 30 feet. Stella heard his call and rushed to his aid. His left leg broke in 2 pieces and was at risk of amputation. Once he was attended to, Stella assumed full command of the lighthouse, and a few weeks later, by order of President Theodore Roosevelt, she was named acting assistant keeper to assume full charge while Captain Ebbets recovered. Now, this had to be, we can assume, Stella's goal or her dream was to be the one in charge of the lighthouse. Captain Ebbets stated in an interview a few years later, during the months that he was incapacitated, he had not a word to say around the lighthouse, but received orders from Stella. Now, she served for a period of 14 months, and this was the only time in her entire tenure at Horton Point that she actually wrote in the keeper's logs. And we'll talk a little bit more about the logs in the next slide. So keepers were responsible to log daily, but the log is a legal-sized ledger, and it is actually a legal document that is supplied by the Lighthouse Board and had open-faced pages for each month. On one side, down the left column, were the dates 1 through 31, and the left page was to note the daily weather conditions. On the right side, keepers were allowed or encouraged to write about things that happened during the month. Repairs, cleaning, passing ships, the arrival of the supply ship, and even visitors. All keepers noted any disasters, any shipwrecks, any major things that occurred. Now, unfortunately, Stella, during the time that she did write in the ledger, only noted weather conditions. We don't have one word from her about anything else that was going on for her or at the lighthouse at that time. On the right side, you see a picture of samples of the keeper's logbooks. Now, Stella Marries. At noon on Tuesday, October 11, 1904, Stella Maria Prince marries George Herbert Terry at Southold Methodist Church. Stella is 36 years old, George is 50. Stella resigns her post at Horton Point Lighthouse on November 1904 officially. Now, what motivated her to leave the only home she ever knew to marry at this relatively late date in her life? We don't really know. The picture on the right is a formal photo of George and Stella around the time of their wedding. I do guess that perhaps this is their wedding picture. Brides from working class families did not dress in what we would think of as typical bridal gowns, but rather would dress in what was their best outfit. So this could well be George and Stella on their wedding day, or certainly around that time. Now, once they married, George and Stella moved. Stella moved into George's home. So this is a new beginning for Stella. George is a retired seaman, a cook who works in the general store in Orient. The couple moved to his home on Navy Street, and this home is still standing actually. Local lore states when Stella saw George's one-room cottage, she protested that she could not live in so modest abode. He spent the next few years adding on the comparatively spacious 6-room home, completing it in 1904 when they married. Now, if you look at the picture on the right, you'll see this is the side view of their home. The one-room cottage that was George's original home is what juts out at the back. That was his kitchen/parlor. It was literally one room, and then there was a hole in the ceiling with a ladder that he climbed up, and that was his bedroom upstairs. Now, for Stella, he built a comparatively spacious, added on a living room, a dining room, and a full stairway with 2 additional bedrooms upstairs. So that now became a six-room house, 3 bedrooms, and 3 rooms downstairs. They also had a 2-seater outhouse out back. One can only speculate as to why that was important. Obituaries. Finally, I'd like to share a bit of information on the Prince family from their obituaries. Obituaries are a rich source of information when conducting historical research. In fact, when I began looking into Stella's life, I thought that Caroline, Stella's mother, died young because there wasn't anything written about her. However, her obituary showed that she lived to be 89 years young, having lived longer than her husband, both her daughters, and even their husbands. Now, in the order of their passing, Edward Scott, Lucy's husband, died around 1900. There is no available information about him, other than the fact that he was an Irish immigrant. He worked as a jeweler and owned his own business on the South Fork. And, of course, he married Lucy, and they had 4 children. Lucy died February 12, 1914, following a protracted illness at the home of her parents. She was 44. 3 of her 4 children still lived with her, and the youngest, stayed and lived with his grandparents from then on. George Prince, Stella's father, died in April 13, 1922, at 80 years old, again in Southold. Stella Marie Prince Terry died February 23, 1928. After spending the winter in the care of her mother, she returned to Navy Street for the holidays, and she died in February at the age of 60. George Herbert Terry, Stella's husband, died in 1935 in Orient. He was 81 years old. And then finally Carolyn Merrill Prince died June 12, 1936 at 89 years young. She died on Prince Lane with her grandson John taking care of her. John and his wife continued to live on in Prince Lane. Now, another interesting note about the Prince and Terry families: George Terry is buried in a plot in Orient, but the entire Prince family is buried in Willow Hill Cemetery in the Merrill plot. Carolyn's parents, Carolyn, George Prince, Lucy, and Stella are all buried, and actually John Scott as well, Lucy's son, are all buried in the cemetery in Willow Hill in Southold. Now, I would like to thank everybody for their interest in Stella, and I hope this was informative. In particular, I'd like to thank Southold Historical and Deanna Witt Walker, the Executive Director at Southold, Amy Folk, the keeper of the collection and historian, for all their support and encouragement. Special thanks goes to the intrepid researcher Dan McCarthy from Southold Library, without whom this presentation would not be nearly as interesting. Dan is terrific. And to Don Bales, author of Horton Point Lighthouse, which is really my Bible for research. It's my go-to book, and throughout this presentation and the book I'm writing, I have it close at hand at all times. And it's also a good read. So if you wish to know a little more about Stella or life in these times, the last 2 slides list the resources that were used for the presentation. Again, thank you very much.